You're watching Global Insight, where we speak to experts from around the world on issues making headlines. As the nation grieves the loss of some 155 people who lost their lives in the crowd-crushing incident in the party district of Seoul, the question has been raised, could this disaster have been prevented? President Yoon Suk-yeol has ordered a probe into the cause of the fatal crush. So how will the investigation unfold, and how should it really inform Korean society on how to make sense of this tragedy that happened? We're joined by Hee-eun, Associate Dean and Professor of Law at Handong International Law School, and David TIZZARD, Professor of Korean Studies at Seoul Women's University. Thank you both for joining us today. And Professor Lee, my first question goes to you. President Yoon, he's ordered a probe into the accident. And, well, first of all, what would be the focus of this investigation? And how would that really advise authorities in regards to follow-up measures?
All right. Well, good morning. Well, according to Korean law, the state has the responsibility for protecting the lives of the citizens and the people that live in Korea, as well as mitigating disasters. And so because there's a positive legal obligation here for the Korean government to protect people, the probe will, of course, center on what the government could have done in response to this situation. So first of all, looking at the cause of the tragedy, and then certainly looking at what policies were in place that could have prevented this tragedy from occurring. And then if there were no policies clearly laid out for the police and other officials to respond to this tragedy, then basically what can be done in terms of reforming the rules and regulations so that law enforcement and others can sort of address these kinds of problems going forward. So basically, the question is from the government side, how can the government respond to these kinds of incidences so that they can be prevented in the future? But also, I would like to add that the probe could also look at the actions of the private individuals or the actors who were also potentially involved in this incident. So you might look at the activities of the nightclubs in the area, as well as other high volume establishments, basically to think about, how could they have done a better job managing the number of people in the area. And also look at, the actions of individuals and others in the crowd themselves to see, did something happen within the crowd itself that could have sort of caused this incident, and so therefore address the underlying problem that exists here. So I think here, both on the public side and the private side, the probe will likely address, again, the causes, as well as then how can address these policies going forward for the government to respond to these situations so they don't happen ever again.
Sure. And Professor Lee, well, what makes the situation quite tricky really is that the nature of this gathering, it wasn't an official gathering or an organized demonstration where, normally the organizers, they would report to local authorities how many people they expect to turn up. And also there are people just coming from all over Korea. So it was really not just a local affair, but a nationwide event. So what kind of weaknesses could there have been in the bureaucratic process of handling such a wide-scale, unorganized gathering?
Right. So I think in my previous answer to you, in terms of looking at sort of the public-private sort of distinction here in terms of responsibility and who can sort of address these kinds of problems so they don't happen again, the big question here is foreseeability. Was the event or what was the situation predictable? And so, as you were referring to, the police in responding to this tragedy noted that this was not a registered event. So, for example, if you have a festival, a place where you will have large crowds gathering, and you expect large number of people to be present, the police are dispatched in order to deal with crowd control and potentially, unsettling situations where the crowd could get out of control. But in this instance, because this was not a registered event, this was not a public event sponsored by the government, the police were not necessarily prepared to deal with sort of this crowd control matter. They were only there really to deal with crime. So if sex offenders, drug use, any sort of illegal activity, so that happened on the ground. So here, the big question here again is, could the government have foreseen that this kind of event could have happened? And so, you see at the beginning now these stages of now people potentially sort of pointing the finger at sort of the police or other government officials, saying that this was not something that could have been prevented. So I think, again, I think this is sort of at the beginning stages. We'll have to sort of see as the probe continues to see, what comes out of this findings of this investigation. But also like to add again that, there also needs to be potentially looking at the liabilities on the private side. So I would expect to see liability and civil suits being brought against certain individuals in the area, from the club owners to others who could have potentially done more to prevent this situation from happening. But in any event, I think this is such an early stage that we'll have to see how this moves forward because of the probe and the sensitivity of these issues.
I see. And Professor TIZZARD, now, a couple of Western media, they've pointed out that South Koreans are quite used to crowds, especially in very busy areas like Seoul, where commuters in the morning, they cram into subway stations. There's quite a bit of pushing, really. And many are citing, well, a lack of education when it comes to safety and emergency response. And, well, as an educator in Korea, I mean, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, good morning. Just before I start, I'd like to just express my sympathy and condolences to those involved. The two educational institutes that I work at have lost members, and having to go into the lecture rooms this week has been very difficult for everybody. I would also say that during South Korea's many successes, I've celebrated in those, but nothing makes me realize my love for the people in this country than when it experiences such tragedies. You asked me about perhaps education amongst the young people. No, I think it's very sensitive for us to be wary of victim blaming. The professor has rightly looked at public responsibility, private responsibility, that of the government. Should we be looking at the people involved in terms of their education and how they move through these things? I think it's perhaps not really the time for that. We do have this tragedy. We do know that in different cities and in different cultures, people move at different speeds. There are different signs, there are different codes and ways in which we can do that. There is also this idea that when South Korea achieves great success, people like to point to unique characteristics, whether it might be Han, whether it might be Nunchi, a feeling of sadness or an emotional intelligence. We like to look for these unique events, particularly in times of success. But for this tragedy in particular, people in South Korea move through the city without such tragedies taking place on a regular occurrence, whether it's at K-pop concerts. We recently saw BTS down in Busan, football and baseball stadiums in particular, subways, and these don't happen on a regular occurrence. So I'm not really sure that it's appropriate at the moment to talk about education and how people might be moving through such large crowds, although I do understand the necessity of looking at it in that way.
I see. And Professor Lee, well, the government's designated Yongsan-gu district, which is where the town of Itaewon is located. It's designated as a special disaster zone. So what does this really mean or entail?
So this designation is governed by a Korean law, obviously. It's governed by the Framework Act on the Management of Disasters and Safety. And so whenever there's a large-scale disaster, whether natural or man-made, the government has designated sort of special administrative as well as fiscal, financial, and medical support for those victims who are affected by such a disaster. So under the law, when you designate an area as a special disaster zone, and you can, the people who are the victims of such a disaster are entitled to receive basically monetary support, there's other kinds of relief for victims, as well as basically payments, exemptions related to school fees even, as well as with respect to other financial obligations that they may have with respect to their loans, or any taxes that they may owe to the government can be either waived or delayed. And so we've had recent experiences, of course, with the special disaster zone, of course, during the COVID period, where the Daegu area was designated as such. And then, of course, the very tragic incident of the Seoul ferry accident in 2014, where Ansan, where many of the students...
Oh, we seem to have lost the connection there for a bit. Let's just turn to you for a sec, Professor TIZZARD. Now, how does disaster response really work? Right now, authorities are, of course, focusing on recovery efforts and really supporting survivors, their families. What comes after that?
Well, I think Professor Lee was mentioning the financial compensation that is provided and various legal things that can take place. I would like to try to draw our attention to the psychological effects of what's happening here, especially on the young people, and trying to see it through their eyes, because they've grown up in a completely different environment from us, the young people here in South Korea. They might have witnessed the collective trauma of the Seoul tragedy. They've then lived through roughly 2 years of online education during the pandemic, in which, let's remember, during that pandemic, we didn't know how it will turn out. And now they've come to this heartbreaking tragedy again. So this is a collection, a domino effect of psychologically damaging incidents upon them. And I think rather than money, there needs to be an emotional response. There needs to be a response that cares for them, listens to them and understands them, and tries to see them through their eyes and experiences rather than our own. I've been rather shocked over the past few days, having seen the shocking footage that was available on social media. I know the news reports blur it, but many people will have accessed this information through social media first. And it really left me unable to sleep for a while. And then seeing again footage from India with the collapse of the suspension bridge there, I think we also need to start looking at the psychological and social long-term effects of seeing such death on our screens, on our phones, and what that's doing to the population, because it cannot be easy. South Korea now, I believe, it needs to provide an emotional response to the people of all ages, but particularly those in their late teens and early 20s who may have lost friends and loved ones again during this situation. And that emotional response should come top down. It comes from all members of society. It comes from us in education, in the media, the president, everywhere. And I think that's the most important thing for the country at the moment.
When Professor Lee, as Professor TIZZARD was just saying, it really isn't the first major accident the country has seen where young people in particular lost their lives. What kind of questions or conversations do you think will have to really emerge from this tragedy?
Well, clearly, I mean, in terms of addressing these kinds of problems, this is a problem for all of Korean society. So this is really an important aspect in terms of thinking about how to address these kinds of issues going forward as a country, and then seeing what we can do to prevent these kinds of situations. And so I think, in sort of the long run and looking at these kinds of tragedies, the question of responsibility in terms of thinking about, how can we as a society, as government, as a people, sort of take care of ourselves when it comes to these kinds of events. And so, going forward, I think what's really important is not just, of course, education, I think, which, of course, Professor TIZZARD, I think, has clearly said in terms of addressing just all of us together as top down, from the government to the people, but also, for us as a society, giving care to each other, right? And so, since we live in a modern society which is very busy, and of course, we're, everyone's into their own business, but of course, caring for one another and practicing the golden rule. And so I think this is the opportunity for us as a society to reflect and say, how can we treat our neighbor like ourselves? And so I think this is the kind of attitude that I think going forward we can take, and then hopefully improve and be a better society so that we can care for each other.
Would you like to expand on that, Professor TIZZARD, before we go? Any conversations that you'd like to see emerge from this just terrible tragedy that happened?
It's definitely not my position to say what the conversation should be. I think it's important for us to open our ears and provide spaces. I have been rather pleased to see that conversations around mental health are increasing among South Korean young people, and also the availability provided to them in terms of support centers or sangdam counseling. These are really growing in number over the years, and I think that's really for the better. Decades ago or a few years ago, that wasn't necessarily a conversation, but it's part of young people's life these days. And so I think it's important, rather than the conversation itself, which should take place, it's also important to open our ears and to see what these young people are saying, and remember that they might not necessarily express things in words or terms that we're used to, because they're part of a different generation, and we need to be cognizant of how they want to express themselves or don't want to express themselves. It won't be easy. The generational gap created by digital divides and first modernity and second modernities in South Korea is as real as anywhere in the world. But these young people are the future, and sadly some of them have left us, and we wish our thoughts to their family, and we need to try to listen to how they want to go forward.
Well, what I'm gathering from what you both said is that we don't, it's not just material kind of recovery responses that we need, but really just the emotional kind of structure, infrastructure, systematic support that all these people need and we as a society need. And well, thank you very much for joining us today. Professor Hee-eun, Associate Dean and Professor of Law at Handong International Law School, and Professor David TIZZARD, Professor of Korean Studies at Seoul Women's University. Again, we really appreciate your time this morning.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Again, thank you to our viewers for watching. Global Insight will be back with more insights on issues making headlines on Wednesday, South Korea time. Until then, have a good day or evening wherever you are. Goodbye.